Well, can we not share this until we hop on to the until we introduce Ms. Gable?
There we go.
And just let me know when you're ready to go live, and then we can start.
Okay, we are ready. We're live.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alonzo Washington. I am the Vice Chair of the Ways and Means Committee and the Chair of the Education Subcommittee in the Maryland House of Delegates. Thank you for joining us today for this very important briefing on equity in education. As we navigate our way through this pandemic, the disparities in educational outcomes for students are at risk to grow even further. School discipline is an issue that I and other members of the Ways and Means Committee and throughout the House of Delegates have been working on for a very long time. And I look forward to addressing these issues today with some of our guest presenters. The purpose of today's briefing is not only to see where we are now, but what we can do further to improve educational outcomes for every student, regardless of zip code or where they live. Today, we'll be hearing from the Maryland State Department of Education, Ms. Mary Gable, the Assistant State Superintendent, Dr. Dara Shaw, Executive Director of Office of Research. Then we'll hear from Maryland State Longitudinal Data System Center from Mr. Ross Goldstein and Dr. Angela Hinberger. And lastly, we'll hear from Strong Schools Maryland from Ms. Shamoya Gardner, who's a Deputy Director. Before we begin our presentation, I wanted to introduce one of our newest members, not only to the House of Delegates, but to the Ways and Means Committee, Ms. Delegate Dana Jones from District 30A. Delegate, we want to welcome you to Ways and Means and congratulate you on your appointment. We're excited to have you on the Education Subcommittee and also in Ways and Means, so congratulations to you. Absolutely. So with that said, I wanted to start off by just saying we're going to go through all of the presentation. We're going to go through the first presentation from the Maryland State Department of Education first, and then we're going to take questions right after that. So if members could let me know when they want to ask a question by raising their hand, or I believe that's an option on here, or just place it in the chat box that you have a question, and I'll call you from there. So with that said, let's start with Ms. Mary Gable from the Maryland State Department of Education, and looking forward to having this discussion with everyone on the Education Subcommittee. Thank you. Ms. Gable?
Yes, thank you, Delegate Washington and other members of this committee. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss these issues in discipline and equity. Next, please. We're going to be talking about two things this morning. One is suspensions and expulsions and the data related to that. And the second is arrest data. First, we're going to start with out-of-school suspensions and expulsions. Before you are just some highlights of pieces of information regarding out-of-school suspensions. This is an out-of-school suspension, is a removal by the principal for a particular reason, and that's removing the student from the current educational program. Expulsion is for a longer period of time, 45 days or longer. There are different times of out-of-school suspensions. We're putting those together. For the purpose of this discussion today, we're going to look at suspensions and expulsions together to kind of constitute removal. Dara, in a few minutes, is going to give you some data and explain why we're putting those together. For the purpose of discussion, a suspension is a legal absence for a student. So if the student is removed, they are allowed to make up their coursework or expected to make up their coursework. They're given full credit for that work while they're removed from the school, whether it be 1 or 2 days or longer. Another point, a student may not be suspended solely for attendance. So if a student is not attending, a student is not further suspended for that reason. Next slide, please. One of the specific pieces that I wanted to note is a Comore regulation on suspension and expulsion for students who are pre-K to 2. The state board instituted this Comore regulation a couple of years ago, and it basically says that students in pre-K to 2 cannot be suspended or expelled, except if it's an incident related to a federal law, and the federal law would be related to a weapon, a gun, which has federal law associated with it and a removal. They may not be suspended, may only be suspended for not more than 5 days per the incident, as long as there is a consultation with a psychologist or another mental health professional to talk about, is there an imminent threat of serious harm or staff that cannot be eliminated through other interventions or supports. Like in all suspensions, whether at any age, pre-K through 12, it's the principal who does ultimately make that decision, and that the parent or guardian has to be immediately contacted. Next, please. And I'm going to turn it over to Dara to take a look at the data related to that.
Hi, thank you, Mary, and thank you to the committee for having us here today. I'm going to go through some data on out-of-school suspensions and expulsions. As Mary said, the data that you're going to see combines suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, and expulsions. We're looking at all removal incidences together, any incidents where the student is removed from the classroom and sent to another setting, sent home, basically. The number of expulsions is very, very, very small in comparison to the number of suspensions, and all of the trends are the same, so it made sense to combine them. On every slide of data that you're going to see 2 pieces of information. On the right-hand side is going to be a table with the absolute number of incidences. In this case, you can see in 2018-19, there were 67,607 removal incidences of students. That means, again, out of school suspension or expulsion. So on the right-hand side of every slide, you'll see an absolute number. On the left-hand side of every slide, you'll see a chart that gives you a sense of the relative scale of that number. We felt that it was important to give you what the actual number was, and then some sense of comparison to say, is that a little or is that a lot? What does 67,000 suspensions mean, given the number of students that we have in Maryland? So in this case, in 2018-19, you see 67,000 suspensions. What that equates to on the left-hand side of the screen is that 4.5% of students in that school year were removed at least once. They were suspended or expelled at least once. Again, there were only a handful of expulsions, and so this is basically out of school suspensions. And that number has been just about the same over the last 6 years. But in 2018-19, 4.5% of students were suspended at least once. Please go to the next slide. Next, you'll see the suspensions and expulsions by grade span. Again, on the right-hand side, you'll see the absolute number of suspensions and expulsions. And then on the left-hand side, it'll give you a sense of scale relative. So in grades pre-K to 2, only 0.5% of all students in grades pre-K to 2 were suspended in 2019. Grades 3 through 5, 2.3% of all grades 3 through 5 students were suspended during the last school year. And then the top lines, the green and the purple, you see that those numbers are much higher for middle school. And then high school students, 8% of middle school students were suspended at least once during the last school year. Go to the next slide, please. Next, very specifically wanted to address the questions about equity in suspensions and expulsions. Again, on the right-hand side, you see the absolute number of incidences. And on the left-hand side, you see those in relative terms. So in 2019, 7.8% of all Black students in Maryland were suspended at least once. In 2019, 2.8% of all white students in Maryland were suspended at least once. And 0.8% of all Asian students in Maryland were suspended at least once. So again, the graph gives you a sense of how the absolute numbers relate to one another. Next slide, please. We also prepared this same information by gender. So 2019, 5.8% of all male students in Maryland were suspended at least once. 3% of all female students in Maryland were suspended at least once. And finally, on the next slide, we have these numbers separated by student disability status. So 9.3% of all students with disabilities in Maryland were suspended from school at least one time last year, whereas 3.8% of all Maryland students who do not have disabilities or who are not identified that way were suspended at least once. Mary will now talk about arrests, again, give you some context for our arrest information, and then I'll show you similar data, but for arrests. And go to the next slide, please.
So arrests in January 2014, the state board adopted regulations guiding student discipline, and specifically arrests on school premises were determined that we would collect data on arrests.Ese are arrests that were within the school or at a school-related activity. We have been collecting this data since the 2015-16 school year. So we have data now, 4 years of data from the 2015-16 to the 2018-19, and we published this data. It's an arrest that occurs as a result of a student by school personnel or referral to by a school personnel to the that occurs on school grounds and referring that to law enforcement. It includes either a physical arrest by the law enforcement or a paper arrest, and the paper arrest is a referral or request for charges by school officials and actually by the law enforcement. We worked with we work with stakeholders, and you're going to see some changes in the data. What you're going to see are arrests per 1,000 students, divided by those students that are that were enrolled. Over time, we have worked to clarify the definition. The first collection of data is always the roughest in 2015-16 to make sure everyone understood exactly what data we were collecting. So over time, we believe through webinars and technical assistance and clarifying some definition, replacing criminal arrest codes with student discipline codes, that we have worked to clarify those definitions. And you'll now look at the data that Dara will share with you. Next, please.
Thank you. So again, here the data are presented in a similar way. We're just talking about arrests with that definition of arrest that Mary just gave. So last school year, 2018-19, there were 3,141 arrests. The equivalent, the number that you can kind of compare to say, is that a little or is that a lot, is that for every 1,000 students that are enrolled in the state, there were 10 arrests, 10.11 arrests. Next slide, please. Here you see it by grade level. Again, right-hand side is how many arrests there were, and then on the left-hand side, you see a way for comparison. So in high school, grades 9 to 12, for every 1,000 high school students enrolled in the state, there were 7.66 arrests. For every 1,000 middle school students, there were 5.27 arrests. For every 1,000 elementary students, there were 0.2 arrests. Next slide, please. Similar information, but disaggregated by race and ethnicity. For every 1,000, I'm talking about the previous school year, so 2018-19. For every 1,000 African-American students in the state, there were 5.86 arrests. For every 1,000 white students, 2.7 arrests. For every 1,000 Asian students, 0.27 arrests. So again, on the right-hand side, you see the absolute numbers of arrests. On the left-hand side, you see the relative numbers. Next slide, please. We have, again, arrests by gender. So for every 1,000 boys in the state, last year there were 4.6 arrests. For every 1,000 girls in the state, there were 2.35 arrests. Next slide, please. And then finally, by disability status, for every 1,000 students identified with disabilities, there were 7 arrests. For every 1,000 students who are not identified that way, there were 3 arrests. So I'll turn it back over to Mary now for some more information beyond what the data show.
Next slide, please. We just wanted to cover a little bit about, so what's happening in the schools in order to address the suspension and expulsion, address arrest. There's really, it's together. What are we doing in order to reduce these numbers of removals from school? You have before you positive behavior interventions and support, referred to frequently as PBIS, which is an evidence-based set of practices that we have in many of our schools. We do a lot of training, which reinforces positive behavior. A number of our schools, many of our schools are doing restorative approaches. Again, it emphasizes building strong relationships and addressing problem behavior and how to repair those relationships, especially when there's conflicts with students. The restorative approaches is a general term that we like to use, which covers a lot of things that you see before you: conflict resolution, peer mediation, circle processes, and so on. Next slide, please. In addition to this, MSDE does a lot of training, and our school systems are working on trauma-informed care. How do we recognize the signs and symptoms? And we do a lot of training, mental health first aid, and we're training not just educators, but could be bus drivers, anyone who could recognize those trauma in students. And especially now, obviously, we are very, working very hard to, as we open schools in a variety of ways that we're opening, virtual, that we're addressing the needs of students. MSDE works directly with school systems. We have been working directly with disproportionality that Dara has highlighted, and how do we provide support, what's happening. And really a major way to take a look at it is to look at your data. Some folks just, if you don't look at your data, you don't know where the situation is and what's happening. Superintendents are looking very carefully at their data, and also members of their team. We also have a coordinated student services model where we looked at a tier approach where all students get certain services, and as you move up the pyramid, obviously there are more intense services. We're also addressing social emotional learning, specifically in helping students to be self-aware, self-managed, and be responsible for decision making, and so on. Next slide, please. And then last but not least, we wanted to just identify some things that the local school systems are doing. Specifically, we identified this for disproportionality. They really are engaged in looking at their data, root cause analysis, and how they are coordinating and working as a central office team, and then as school teams to address multi-tier systems of support. And they've developed data dashboards, and a number of systems have developed plans and how to address that disproportionality. I hope we're within our 10 minutes, or if not, just a little bit over, but that concludes our presentation. Delegate, you're waiting for questions after everyone presents, is that good?
Nope, we're gonna take questions now, so.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for that. We do have one question, and everybody, all the members of the committee, please raise your hand or sign in the chat that you would like to be called on. We're going to first start with Delegate Hartman. You have a question. Delegate Hartman, we're ready for you to speak or ask your question. No? Okay. Anyone else has a We're gonna go to Delegate Eversole.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have this question fully formed because I thought we were going at the end, but it's an important one for us to address, and I think we might address it several times. We passed legislation a few years ago to pretty much prohibit suspensions for K-2. And the data shows that there's been a 50% decrease, but given the restrictive nature of that legislation, I'm a little surprised that the numbers are running where they are still right now. We went from about, I'm going to be general, 4,000 a year to about 2,000 a year. I would have expected a more significant drop given the nature of the way that we wrote that bill and the number of sort of guardrails there were. So do we have any insight as to why or what's going on here that it would be, the number would remain not high, but relatively higher than I expect?
Let me just address that a little bit. This is Mary. We also have been looking at the data over time, and last year at the end of the, or I guess I have to think about time, when we got our latest data, Dr. Salmon specifically shared the data with the superintendents. We also were taking a look at the reasons for the suspension, doing additional education. We are reviewing and redoing actually the guidelines regarding discipline, and there have been numerous conversations. To your point, these are suspensions for pre-K to 2. We've looked at the reasons for the suspensions. Superintendents and school staffs are also looking at the reasons and to address some of that and to obviously provide training to their team. So there is a look at those suspensions that we have been doing, and the local superintendents and the state superintendent is looking at.
Are you getting pretty good cooperation from the locals in working with you on that? Because I think it's a pretty immediate thing that we really hoped it would die off, and the number of suspensions, but the data all shows that suspending kids at that age is not really effective. So do you have any kind of timeline? Do you have any idea when we might get some idea and maybe find something to ameliorate that a little bit?
Well, as I addressed, I think a major thing was really looking at this, just sit down. And there was a discussion with the state superintendent, with all superintendents, to say, hey, let's look at this and let's look at the reasons. And I, based on our work, and I work in student services and we work with directors of student services, and we have been since the very beginning, training and defining. But I think folks don't, and we're talking about large numbers of schools, and it's important that we get the message out to everyone. I believe that we're making a commitment, our state superintendent's making a commitment, the local superintendents are saying, oh, let me take a look at that, because the things occur, and until you see all the data combined, like you just saw, like we've shared, but we've shared it by school system, by reason. And so we're certainly expecting reductions in that area.
Good. I'm glad it has a red flag on it. Thank you very much.
It does, sir. It does.
And if I could add to that, at our June state board meeting, we presented very similar data to what you have seen here, but very specifically for pre-K to 2, looking at the impact of the legislation, looking at the number of suspension incidences before and after the legislation was passed. Your math is right. It was half.
Yeah, some papers covered that broadly.
It went from about 2,500 suspension incidences to about 1,200, but the number is not 0. You're correct. At our next state board meeting right now, we are putting the finishing touches on a follow-up to that, again, highlighting pre-K to 2 suspensions only, that talks a little bit more about the type of incidents, so not just putting them all into one bucket, but that talks more specifically about the type of disciplinary infraction that was associated with that suspension. Again, we're putting the finishing touches on that now. It's specifically pre-K to 2, and it's going to our state board at the end of this month.
Chair, if I could, just one real quick one, and I don't think it's really a question, just an ask.
Sure.
Okay, thanks. No, it was, if you said no, I'd have gotten off. There's a suggestion too, in lieu of suspensions, that schools are resorting to other less formal sort of removals. Is anybody looking into that at all? Or is that on the radar also? Sort of a yes or no question if you guys are thinking about that.
I want to say I know that we do not collect removals because there's not a handle on that. I would say that is a question that's been asked by our state board. I'm a former high school principal for quite a number of years and an assistant principal prior to that in central office. I can tell you that in my setting, you couldn't remove a student from school unless there was an action that occurred. There was no sending, go home for a while. So I believe it's on, I do firmly believe that it's on radar screens. It is a question that's asked, and it's a question that certainly superintendents and principals need to ask within their own environments.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And we're going to take one more question, and then I have a question, but Delegate Guyton, if you have a question. And if I can ask our presenters to be succinct in their answers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Delegate Ebersol, for your questions, because I was very interested in the answers to those as well. I wanted to ask you, thank you, Mary and Dara, it's nice to see you. I wanted to ask you about kids who are currently in the process of the disciplinary system when we went to the shutdown. So are those kids now 5 months later, are they still, if they haven't yet been expelled or suspended, where are they in that process? Is that are there guidelines for interventions that are going to occur during virtual learning this fall, or are they going to be suspended from e-learning or forgiven? Are there any guidelines or discussion around those things?
Delegate Guyton, it's good to see you. I don't know about guidelines. I can tell you absolutely that it has been a discussion with directors of student services that we have been meeting with weekly since schools closed. So you have a temporary suspension, a student who was out for 1 or 2 days and schools closed. There was lots of discussion about getting those students back into school. This is a temporary thing. As I said originally, students can make up the work. And so I would think that in discussing with 24 directors of student services, they were all, let's get that suspension closed, because we're not talking a long, long time. Expulsions, again, I think it's up, and I can't answer that regarding specifics, but I would expect that the school systems were addressing those and identifying what kind of services would be provided to those students and where that status is, but I can't answer that. We'd have to get back to you on that.
I think that was a great question. I think it'll be good to hear that information. I think my question aligns with some of the questions that Delegate Ebersol were asking about the breakdown of the numbers of the suspensions and expulsions, and understanding that. I know you said you're going to do those for pre-K to pre-K to 2. But I think it's important to have the scope from the entire, from pre-K to 12. So when can we have that information? Because I think that's going to be telling to us, because if these are folks are getting out of school suspensions and expulsions for non-violent offenses, that doesn't sound right to me. And so I would like an answer to that. I want to know when can we see that? Because for years I've been asking for a breakdown in data, and that bill has not moved at all in the last few years. So I want to see what those numbers look like.
Sure. We can bring that back to here to get a report. I can also tell you now, for at least for 2019, about half of the suspensions and expulsions were due to fighting. The next largest category, about 35%, were due to disruption or disrespect. And then there are smaller shares for things like weapons or dangerous substances, drugs and alcohol.
And then can we get the breakdown by those categories, then by race as well? So the fighting, the disruptions by race and gender. So we have accurate information on those. That information is really important. And I just, MSD, I would like to know, I didn't hear any alarms ring from you guys when you went through those numbers of arrests and the breakdown in race, and how African Americans are identified in that categories of arrests. I didn't see it seems to be no alarms in what we need to do, what interventions need to happen in these school districts, when interventions need to happen at that particular school. I want to know, what are the interventions that are occurring when we see these numbers at such a high level of African Americans being disproportionately in arrests and suspensions too. So I'd like to hear from you guys on what the interventions are.
I think also it's worth mentioning, and Ms. Guyton knows this because she's seen me present before, but myself especially, working with research, I have my research, my statistics hat on, which is, we're presenting the information to you in as clear a way as we possibly can to get your questions answered. It certainly doesn't mean that we are dispassionate about the information itself. So just wanted to clarify that. We're researchers, not robots, but it doesn't mean that we don't have a passionate feelings about the data, but we try to present it to you in as straightforward a way as possible.
And if I can just add to that, Delegate Washington, there is posted on our website a delineation of all suspensions, all expulsions every year by reason. And that data, it is broken down by race, by cause, by gender, by level, and that data is a regular data that we do have on our website that we report annually. So that data can be provided. And secondly, I like Dara, I do want to say that when we present, we are calling attention to this data, and it is clear by the data what the issues are, and it's kind of Dara's role and my role to present that to you. But I did not enforce or reinforce enough the disproportionality. We are doing work in our schools on disproportionality. We are doing work on racial bias. We are doing multiple pieces of work, but the disproportionality work is identifying all of the data for schools so that schools can take a look at their disproportionate numbers and address those. And as I mentioned, there's actually someone on my team who is working with school systems in particular on those issues.
Yeah,
so, thank you.
Thank you for that. But that sounds great. But the numbers have been the same for the last 5 years now, and they have not changed. The disproportionality numbers have not changed. So there must be something that we, or the MSDE, or the state school system, or even the local school systems are not doing to drive down those numbers and that disproportionality. So I just urge that MSDE find solutions to these issues, and I'm looking forward to working with you on those. But the numbers are the same. They've been the same for 5 years since we've been collecting this data. So let's stop there and let's move on to our next presenter. We're going to ask Marine Longitudinal Data Systems, Mr. Goldstein and Dr. Hindenberger to present. Thank you.
Great. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Hi. And we have a slide deck as well as, so you can bring that up. So Delegate Washington, members of the committee, good morning. I'm Ross Goldstein. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland Longitudinal Data System Center. And with me today is Dr. Angela Hindenberger. She's the Director of Research for the Center and Assistant Research Professor at the University of Maryland School of Social Work. We're going to provide you with a brief overview of the center, talk about the data that the center has that are relevant to the topic of equity and discipline in education, and then provide some examples of how this data can be leveraged for policy analysis. Next slide, please. The MLDS Center is an independent state agency that develops and maintains a data system containing student and workforce data from all levels of education and from the state's workforce. The purpose of the MLDS is to generate timely and accurate information about student performance that can be used to inform policymakers and help improve the state's education system. Next slide. Great. I'm going to talk a little bit about the data. First, what can and cannot be collected is defined by state law. Student data must be data relating to or impacting student performance. And there are specific types of data that are prohibited. Specifically, medical and health data are prohibited, and child welfare data are prohibited. Although I would note that this committee, the Ways and Means Committee, passed a bill that would have permitted the center to include certain child welfare data elements. The bill passed the House, but ran out of time during the shortened session. We draw on data sources that cover the full student life cycle. We have early childhood data, K-12, college, and workforce. Our data starts with academic year 2007-2008. We presently have over 3 million individual person records in the system. 50% of those records have at least a match in 2 sectors, and 20% have records across all 3 sectors, K-12, post-secondary, and workforce. So just quickly to go around this wheel of data providers, just to give you a quick overview of what's in the system. MSDE provides data on K-12 public school students and staff. The data include attendance, completion, assessments, discipline, courses, and grades and teachers. Higher Education Commission provides data on post-secondary students enrolled in credit-based courses in Maryland's public and state-aided institutions. These data include information on majors, courses, grades, degrees, and financial aid. And the Department of Labor provides the unemployment insurance data, which includes quarterly wages and industry of employment. And we also receive adult education data, which currently includes the GED and NEDP graduates. And this year, we're beginning to expand our collections of adult ed data by including apprenticeship, correctional ed data, and data from other adult education programs. And then finally, the Department of Juvenile Services will be providing juvenile delinquency records. And I'll talk more about that in a second. We also have certain supplemental data sources, such as the College Board and the National Student Clearinghouse. We also receive data from MVA to help us facilitate our identity resolution process. State law requires us to disclose to the public the data that we collect through a data inventory, and that's available on our website in an interactive format. State law also prevents us from sharing unit record data. So everything that we report out has to be an aggregate de-identified information. There is one exception though to the prohibition on sharing unit record data. There was a change in state law last year that now allows us to work with the comptroller's office. We can share unit record data with the comptroller and receive aggregate de-identified data tables back that provide average annual income. This will help us address an important gap in the workforce data. The fact that the unemployment insurance data does not include data for federal employees, military employees, employees of certain nonprofits, and independent contractors. Since those employees still have to pay taxes, even though they don't have to participate in UI, this partnership with the comptroller will allow us to increase our knowledge of workforce outcomes. Next slide, please. So the discipline data was added to the MLDS data inventory in September of 2019, pursuant to legislation that passed that same year. The data goes back to academic year 2007-2008. As discussed in the prior presentation, the administration of the discipline and the data collection is conducted by the local school systems pursuant to MSDE guidelines. The data are reported to MSDE, and then the MLDS receive the data from MSDE. The data elements that we receive from MSDE include the 504 indicator. That's an indicator that the student has an accommodation plan under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. We receive the disability code, if any. We receive the offense code, and should clarify that the offense code is only the most serious offense for the given incident that occurred. We receive the date of the offense, the disposition code, the length of removal, and whether there was a physical injury, and the type of services, if any, provided to the student. Next slide. For juvenile services, the juvenile services data were authorized for inclusion in the MLDS in 2019. And in fact, it was the same legislation that authorized the discipline data. We're still in the process of fully incorporating that data into the system. Currently, the governing board has approved the inclusion of the identity data elements. This was done as a first step to allow our analysts the opportunity to determine their ability to match the DJS data to the MLDS data. There was some concern because there's not a shared unique identifier like the state-assigned student ID or social security number. However, now that our analysts have had an opportunity to work with this initial information from DJS, they're confident in their ability to match the DJS data with the MLDS student data. And so in September, we plan to go to our governing board and ask for their approval to include over 30 new data elements from DJS. Those elements include the following categories: jurisdiction of residence, the offense code, category and date, the intake decision, adjudication and disposition information, when supervision begins and ends, placement name and type, and the admission and release reasons. Next slide. So having the discipline and juvenile services data incorporated into the MLDS will allow us to research and report on long-term outcomes of students who are subject to disciplinary actions and/or the juvenile justice system. Long-term outcomes that we can look at include graduating from high school, enrolling in college, college persistence in graduation, and workforce engagement and earnings. This data will also allow researchers to study different interventions and how successful those interventions are in the long term. And finally, the Department of Juvenile Services is interested in using the longitudinal data to gain another indicator of the outcomes of their students. Currently, DJS is only able to look at recidivism as an outcome, which is a negative outcome. MLDS will allow them to look at positive indicators such as academic success and workforce engagement for their population. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn it over to Dr. Henneberger to talk about some of the future research plans that she and the research team are working on.
Good morning. Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Delegate Washington, and thank you to the members of the committee. So today I will tell you a little bit about the MLDS Center Research Branch, our upcoming projects on equity and discipline in education, and I'm most interested in hearing any questions of interest from the committee that the MLDS might be able to help answer in the future. The MLDS partners with institutions from the University System of Maryland to provide advanced statistical analyses and policy and program evaluation to inform education and workforce policy and practice in Maryland. The MLDS Center partners with faculty, staff, and graduate students from a wide range of expertise, including faculty in criminology and criminal justice, economics, and education. Equity research is an active area for the MLDS Center Research Branch. For example, most recently, we presented research to the Kirwan Commission that looked at the role of school concentrated poverty above and beyond the role of individual student poverty in predicting long-term outcomes such as high school graduation, college enrollment, and workforce wages. This committee showed great leadership and foresight in passing legislation to permit the inclusion of student discipline and juvenile justice data in the MLDS. This data is critically important for providing a complete picture of student development and outcomes in academics and careers. In terms of upcoming projects, we are currently conceptualizing a few research projects related to equity and discipline in education. Due to time constraints, I will talk about the first one more in depth, and then I will also mention the other two and how they might help the work of the committee. We can also go to the next slide if that's possible. Thank you. So first, as an example of how we can evaluate a program to better understand investments and policy, we are conceptualizing a study that leverages data from a randomized controlled trial of positive behavioral interventions and supports, or PBIS. Like was stated before, PBIS is a multi-tiered system of supports that guides evidence-based practices for improving academic and behavioral outcomes for all students. We plan to examine the long-term academic and behavioral outcomes associated with the intervention implemented in elementary school to determine whether the intervention worked in the long term and for which types of students the intervention might be most beneficial. For example, we are interested in whether PBIS might reduce disproportionalities in outcomes. These findings will provide the state with information to help make decisions about the cost effectiveness and the benefits of scaling up this particular intervention program or programs like it. Second, as an example of analyses relating early behavioral problems with later academic failure, which is a key component of the school to prison pipeline, we are working with multiple stakeholder groups, including MSDE and DJS, to propose research that will examine the effects of local discipline guidelines on suspensions and student performance in pre-K through 12 and beyond into college and career. Third, as an example of research that would be of relevance for juvenile services, we are working with DJS to think about the outcomes for students involved in juvenile services from a positive youth development perspective. And this goes back to what Ross was saying about looking at not only recidivism as an outcome, but also thinking about positive youth development outcomes in terms of engagement with academics and career. And these findings could help DJS to tailor services to improve student educational and workforce outcomes. And finally, I'm happy to answer any questions and talk about any of these topics more in depth. And I'm particularly interested in hearing from the committee on any research topics of particular interest that we might be able to help with. Thank you.
Thank you. I cannot see the participants list. Thank you, everybody. I wanted to see if anybody had any questions. Just so far, cannot see that screen, so I don't know. If you are raising your hand, please talk. I cannot find the, the screen that has everybody.
I don't see any raised hand.
Raised hands. Okay. Then I would just like to know when you guys are going to start on those projects, on those future projects. Those all seem very interesting to me. And I just wanted, if you can answer that quick question, that'd be great.
Sure. Right now we're submitting grants to the Institute of Education Sciences to fund these projects. But we are, if there's one of particular interest that might help with the upcoming legislative session, we're more than happy to kind of go ahead and get started on some of that research prior to grant funding to help out.
You mentioned the school to prison pipeline project that you're formulating. Can you is that one that you can help us with before the beginning of session? I mean, I think that's the one that we all really want to tackle right now.
Right. Right now, yes, absolutely. Right now, the DJS data are not yet incorporated into the MLDS. So we're kind of waiting on the data. So I can let Ross speak to that, but certainly I'm more than happy to forefront that research if it would be useful to the committee.
Right, yeah, as I said, we expect the governing board to approve the additional data elements in September's meeting. And then so once that happens, I think we can move relatively quickly to incorporate that data. And I guess what we could do is, perhaps Delegate Washington, if you have time, we can meet with you separately and really drill down into what exactly the research question is, help us frame out what you want so that we can focus both the research efforts and maybe the data loading efforts to make sure that we prioritize the information that you want to get by the session.
Great. Well, I look forward to that. Should I follow up in September after my birthday? We can do that. Whenever you guys are ready, we can.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question, if I could.
Yeah, absolutely, Delegate Smith.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the presenters. I know that there has been considerable scholarship around kind of the performance of students, particularly when they have teachers that are representative of their culture and racial background. So I wanted to know, as we're discussing the school to prison pipeline, do we have any data sources related to suspension rates and the backgrounds of the either officials at the school or the teachers that are initiating those? And if there's a relationship from that perspective between the students and the backgrounds of those that are sometimes facilitating that introduction through their, their vantage point as a teacher or administrator to kind of get someone on that pathway.
Yeah, so it's a great question. Thank you for the question. I have two initial thoughts. So first, I'm not completely sure that we're able to actually link the teacher with the student in terms of which teacher actually disciplined the student. I think that one thing we could think about to try to start getting at that is to think about school diversity in terms of the total teacher population, to think about maybe the proportion of teachers who are minority, or the proportion of staff or principals, higher level administrators who are minority, and whether discipline might be lower for, or disproportionality or discipline for African American students in particular might be lower in those schools compared to schools without as much teacher or staff diversity.
You have a follow-up, Delegate?
I was just mouthing thank you via a mute, so I apologize. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? I don't see any raised hands just yet. Okay, great. Let's move on to our next presentation by Strong Schools Maryland with Ms. Shamoya Gardner.
All right, good morning, Chair Washington and members of the Education Subcommittee. I'm Shamoya Gardner, Deputy Director at Strong Schools Maryland, and I might actually keep my video off for this presentation because I have Comcast and it's terrible. So Sarah, if you could bring our presentation up, please.
Just for the record, Verizon isn't any better.
Is Sarah still on?
Sarah,
Okay.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm trying to get it. I'll get it up in just a second here.
Thank you. And we can go on to that next slide. Awesome. So I am going to actually start this presentation on school discipline and equity with a bit of contextual data so we can frame this through, but then we will go on to talk about suspensions and expulsions, arrest data, alternative schools, the translation of all these things to student outcomes, and a few recommendations. So let's go to the next slide. All right, awesome. And we can actually go past this. On to the next one. Great. So we know that, like the most of America, Maryland's teaching force is overwhelmingly white and female. We know that maybe about a fifth of our teachers identify as Black or African American. But what is deeply concerning here is that our Asian, Latino, and Hispanic, Native, and Pacific Islander students who are broadly more diverse in our teaching force only see themselves represented in about 10% of the teaching force, even though they constitute about more than a quarter of Maryland's overall enrollment. So teachers and students are looking very different demographically, but that is not all. Let's go to the next slide. Thanks. So when we talk about teacher diversity being important, of course it is, but teachers are not the only adults that students are interacting with. When we look at therapists, school principals, people who are considered psychological personnel, and our guidance counselors, often the people we make recommendations to when we try to avert disproportionate uses of exclusionary discipline, we also see that they are overwhelmingly white and female. So this is indicative of the entire school community. Everyone is contributing to the climate and ultimately the way students behave and are treated. And as we have this discussion, it's important to keep in mind. Let's go on to the next slide. So here we'll be talking about combined in-school, out-of-school suspensions and expulsions. So every single removal from class, not just removals from school. And we already know that we're not getting a lot of good information about hidden or informal send home, so we can expect these figures to be higher. When you go to look for information about student discipline, this is what you find. This is how the public has access to the data. It is not synthesized well in charts. Let's go to the next slide. But if you have some time, you might be able to pull out a couple things. You might notice that we've had a slight uptick in the overall percentage of students that were suspended by our public schools. And if you have a bit more time, you might notice that there are 3 counties on the Eastern Shore with comparatively low enrollment when you look at other school districts that have very high percentages of their students being suspended. And a very important thing I hope we all do when we look at this data is just ask ourselves why, instead of trying to come to the conclusion or say anything about the counties that we're seeing. So a good question here is, why did Somerset County suspend 1/5 of its student population? What's happening and how can we help? Let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to present this data in a couple different ways. The first way we can say this is in the 2018-19 school year, our public schools suspended and expelled nearly the equivalent of the student population of the Eastern Shore. And that sounds very different from 5% because we are talking about individual kids. Next slide. So that's about 45,000 students for a total of nearly 80,000 instances, meaning that every student suspended or expelled wasn't necessarily just disciplined once. As a matter of fact, when we look into the data, we see that about 16,000 students were suspended or expelled 2 or more times, and about 1,500 students were suspended or expelled at least 5 times that year. Let's go to the next slide. And this is the last way I'll phrase it. That's more than the combined enrollment of 10 counties. All right. So now that we know that, we can look a bit into disparities. Thank you. So what we see here is a couple of things that we have been seeing, as Delegate Washington said earlier, for years now. We know that male-identified students, and I use that term because we're not collecting data on the full gender diversity of our student enrollment, and it's very difficult to. So I'll say male-identified students, even though they're a little more than half of total student enrollment, there's 67% of those subjected to school push-out or exclusionary discipline. And we also know that Black students, who are only about 1/3 of statewide enrollment, are more than half, nearly 60% of those subject to exclusionary school discipline. And the way that we present this data is just as important as having the data itself, because these are disturbing figures. Next slide, please. And when we look at the intersection of student identity, specifically when we look at students who have educational disabilities or require additional services, we see that these factors actually compound. So students with educational disabilities are represented in the suspension expulsion population at twice the rate they exist in the general population. And we see the trends we saw on the last slide continuing. So if you are a special education student who is also Black, then you are even more likely to be suspended or expelled. And then if you add being a male-identified student on top of that, we're seeing astronomical increases in the use of push-out for those students. Let's go to the next slide. So we spoke a bit earlier about the pre-K to 2 suspension expulsion ban from 2017, and Delegate Eversole asked a great question about why the figures are still so high. So in the 2018-19 school year, we see 1,500 of our youngest students are being pushed out. And we actually have the specific offenses here, and I want to draw your attention to the disrespect and disruption category. And as we know from the presentations earlier, the law says that the instances available for use of suspension or expulsion have to do with a gun or some sort of federal policy that mandates the student be removed. That is not the case that we're seeing here. Attacks on students, fighting, a lot of behaviors that we either expect from school-age children or that should inspire us to ask why, what is going on here, why is a child so young behaving so violently, are resulting in suspensions and expulsions and plenty of missed opportunities. And when we do talk about guns, we saw that there were 6 instances of very young students possessing firearms or some other gun. When we change that category to other weapons, which is very subjective, we see that number jump to 30 instances. So a couple things to keep in mind there. Let's go on to the next slide. And we'll be talking about student arrests. Again, all of the data that's being presented throughout this presentation comes directly from MSDE, is publicly available. Next slide, please. So we saw this figure earlier as well, 3,000 or so student arrests in the 18-19 school year. And I just like us to sit with the fact that that is a large number of children to be arrested at school, period, 3,000 kids. So what has happened to all those students before we even begin to break this data down by demographic? Next slide, please. And I know this may be a little difficult to read, so I'll pull out a few points here. We don't know whether a third of students who were arrested were referred to non-school law enforcement. We don't know who referred about 1,300 of those arrested students to DJS. We don't know what the final outcome was for about a sixth of students who were arrested, and about 2/3 of those students who were arrested were ultimately sent back to school, which means that the offenses for which they were arrested were not quote unquote criminal enough for DJS to say, okay, this child needs to be in our care. And that last figure on line 23, all but 17 of the students arrested were not placed in any sort of detention. So a logical question then is to ask exactly what are students being arrested for? And let's go to the next slide. So this is the category of activities listed in the report that these charts are pulled from. And I like to approach this slide with a why not frame. So let's take alcohol, for example. Why not, when a student is found to be in possession of alcohol, consider a harm reductionist approach? Get curious about how they acquired it, whether the possession is a regular occurrence, whether there's a caring adult in their life who needs to know about this, and whether or not this behavior is normalized at home. This is an opportunity to look into what is happening to a student. And we must also ask ourselves, like, what does an arrest in this instance actually do for the safety of that student or the broader school community? And does it cost us any additional money to process the arrests of these students for nonviolent activities? Next slide, please. And you'll have to, I think, click it for a total of 3 times, but that's good, thanks. So we can see that Maryland has cultivated an arrested student population that is very, very reminiscent of its carceral population. So I guess it can best be surmised as saying that we shouldn't be talking about averting a school to prison pipeline here in Maryland because it's up and functioning. It is active. Next, please. And we know that the existence of any officer on school premises is closely correlated with increased student arrests, which you may say, like, duh, of course. But if we take that for granted, we really do have to consider what decisions we're making when we say that we need armed law enforcement in our schools. So of all of the arrests completed, 91% were completed by police officers assigned to schools. So if you are looking for something, you will find it. And if you over-police behaviors in a context that doesn't require policing, then you will see more instances of people being written up and arrested. Next. And finally, most arrests aren't contributing in the long term to student safety, but they do contribute to long-term impact. So we already know more than 2/3 of students arrested are sent right back to school. And we know that for about 20% of them, we don't know what happened. And that's a major accountability issue. And we also know that 11% of those students who were arrested were sent to alternative school placements, and we'll talk about that in a second. Next. Thanks. So you will note that there are multiple names for this category we're about to get into, and what we'll find here is a lot of truth in the old adage that if you can't name it, you can't claim it or tame it, as it were. Next slide. And this has been a problem for us for a while. So all the way back in 2011, there was a work group for the State Board of Education that attempted to define alternative educational services in the state. Unfortunately, this definition was not adopted, and we've yet to adopt one consistent one that is clearly identifiable, that you can go to MSD's website, type in alternative schools, and get a result. Next, please. And a part of the reason why we're struggling with this definition is because alternative school models are diverse. And some do produce really good results, particularly when they're like the academic kind that are focused on a magnet program or something career related that has a specific goal in mind for students. But when we look at student behavior focused alternative schools in particular, we see consistently that they yield negative academic and long-term outcomes for students who attend them. So in defining alternative schools, which will hopefully get us to a point where we can collect complete data on what's happening in alternative schools, it is important to recognize that we need to talk about what we're talking about specifically. We can't say alternative school, mean behavioral school, but only hold up examples of high functioning magnet schools. And finally, let's go to the next slide. So the next 3 slides that you'll see on student outcomes are actually from a presentation Dr. Salmon gave to the state board. So literally everything is from MSC. Next slide, please. And one thing I just want to point out very quickly is that we're starting to see a drop off in overall graduation rates. And if you consider the economic timing of this moment and what was happening as we came out of 2010, this is on its surface a really good reason for you all to protect public school funding in the face of the upcoming economic crisis. And we can talk about resources for that later, but we're seeing that these numbers are beginning to drop. Next slide, please. When we break this data down by student race, and we look immediately to students who were most disproportionately impacted in discipline, Black students are graduating at about the statewide average. But what we also see is that Hispanic or Latino identified students are not being served at the rate that they need to meet 100% graduation rate. Next slide, please. And when we break this graduation data down by special service groups, we'll look immediately to students with disabilities and note that their rates are also significantly lower than the general population, which means they're not getting everything that they need to get to 100%. But we're also seeing even larger gaps for English language learners, which leads me to believe that Hispanic and Latino students are not represented in suspension data, but may not be represented well in other places either, because we're not seeing the positive outcomes we would have hoped for there. Next slide, please. All right, and I am going to attempt to end this very quickly with a few recommendations. So next slide. There are a few legislative actions that I think you all should consider. The first, of course, is overriding the veto of the blueprint for Maryland's future. It must be done because the blueprint, in addition to all of the other policy areas you may have heard about, builds on an existing framework for pursuing restorative practices as alternatives to exclusionary discipline, has specific measures and accountability and reporting in place to ensure the diversification of the educator and school-based workforce, prepares teachers in particular to meet the actual student needs by modifying certification requirements, and identifies funding to meet the objectives. So that has to be number one. We should also really consider revisiting legislation that would establish a definition of alternative schools. A good example is HB 1022 from Delegate Davis in Charles County. And finally, revisit the legislative recommendations from the School to Prison Pipeline Commission because they were not all adopted and they are still extremely relevant.
Thank you.
I think that's it.
All right. Thank you, Shamoya, or Ms. Gardner. And your internet was working perfectly. We heard you the entire time. I promise. We have our first question from Delegate Ebersol.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So you have a couple slides that I'm going to return to, and I have access to them here on my other screen. On what would be probably page 17. It's not labeled. It's the one before the one that's called arrest-worthy activities. And it's looks like it's a piece of the document. First of all, I'd like to know where the rest of that document is. That's a great looking document. But it sort of breaks down how when we do student arrests, and we know there's two kinds. There's ones where they take kids out of the building physically. There's also paper arrests, which are sort of psycho. But I'm curious to know if SROs are acting as an arm of DJS and law enforcement and following through and arresting kids at their order, Or do we find that more of them are, when the SROs are involved, it's more administratively motivated? How does that break down? I know SROs are under some scrutiny now, so we need to know, it's a general question about how they're functioning in this situation where they're doing arrests. Who's telling them what to do?
Yeah, so that is an excellent question, and it is difficult for me to answer that with 100% certainty. What the data suggests is that school resource officers, since they're the ones completing a majority of the paper referrals in particular, which are like how most students get arrested in schools, it would seem to me that they're sort of leading there. But I have also heard from specific school resource officers that sometimes they're directed to do certain things by other school-based personnel because that's the impression that they have of the responsibilities of an SRO. And I'll share a link to this report in the chat for you all.
And then 2 pages later, I want to understand what it said. You had a nicer graphic, but the middle column said the existence of an officer on school premises is closely correlated with increased student arrests. Then the first bullet point says complete 84% arrests. Does this mean, I'm not sure who that's referring to.
That's referring to school resource officers.
So they do 84% of the rest, then 91% when police officers are assigned to schools. And are you differentiating them from school resource officers in that situation?
The report does, yes. And when you combine school resource officers and police who are assigned to individual schools, it comes up to 91.
Okay, thank you. It helps me to understand that graphic. I appreciate it.
Definitely.
Any other questions from anyone else that I don't see in the chat or I don't see yet? Sure, let me just ask you a quick question about this. We know that SROs are arresting, some SROs are arresting students, but can you just speak to how SROs are involved in school discipline and school discipline practices? Is that a thing? Can you talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's a difficult question to answer because I don't know that we have very much in the way of codifying the role of school resource officers in the school, like delineating where their responsibilities end and where other school-based personnel step in with like discipline that has pedagogy behind it. So it's a hard question to answer. We should probably pursue something that would codify that.
Right. Okay. And I guess my question for MLDS is, Ms. Gardner brought up a good point about school graduation rates and related to suspensions. Can one of you speak to any research that you've done on the correlation between the two on school suspension and graduation rates?
Sure. So to date, we have not done any research on the correlation between school suspensions and graduation rates. It is in part of our research plan, though, with what I was talking about earlier, to think about the school to prison pipeline once we get more of the discipline and the DJS data loaded into the system.
If I could also just add to that, that would also, our research needs to be focused on cross-sector questions. And I think that question that you're specifically posing would be all MSDE related data. And so a question that MSDE could be posed to MSDE and reported by them. We would look at more of the cross-sector. So how does it impact college going rates? How does it impact, different questions like that?
No, that'd be great too to have. I think those are types of conversations we need to have this fall before session starts about the correlation. I think that's what we really want to get into and get involved into, how it affects student outcomes. MSDE, can you speak to that at all right now, the correlation between suspensions and graduation rates? Dr. Shaw or Ms. Gable? Did they leave, Sarah? I think so. I didn't know they were leaving. Okay. All right. Any other questions of Ms. Gardner or MLDS? Seeing none, well, thank you all very much. And we appreciate this hearing today. I think we have some great information and some great, a great way to start our kickoff of the next session on issues of equity and suspensions and discipline. So I look forward to seeing some great bills from my colleagues in the House. And so we'll end it there. So thank you, everyone. And thank you to our presenters. And again, welcome Delegate Jones to the Ways and Means Committee. Happy to have you. And Sarah, I guess we can go off live from there.